Every major decision in our marriage isn't made by my husband, but by his friend. Where we live, when to have kids, how we spend money. Yesterday I found out they're dating. I never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am at 3 a.m., sitting on my bathroom floor with my laptop because it's the only place in this house where I can think clearly. I'm 33, live in Boston, and until yesterday I thought I had a pretty normal marriage. Turns out I've been living in some twisted version of reality for the past 4 years. Let me start from the beginning. When I met my husband 6 years ago, she was already there. His best friend since college, this bubbly woman who seemed to know everything about him. At first I thought it was sweet how close they were. She'd helped him through his parents' divorce, supported him during his career changes, and was basically his emotional support system. I figured having a friend like that was actually a green flag. The wedding planning should have been my first real warning sign. Every time we'd sit down to make decisions about our big day, he'd pause and say he needed to run it by her first. The venue? She had opinions about the acoustics. The menu? She was concerned about the caterer's reputation. The guest list? She somehow had veto power over who could attend our wedding. I remember sitting in the florist's office, looking at centerpieces and watching my future husband text her photos of every single arrangement. When she didn't respond within an hour, he got visibly anxious and said we should come back another day. I brought it up once gently, asking if maybe we could make some decisions just between us. He looked at me like I'd suggested we elope to Vegas without telling anyone. He explained that she just had really good judgment, that she'd never steered him wrong, and that he valued her input on important life decisions. I convinced myself this was just pre-wedding jitters and that things would settle down after we got hitched. They didn't. Our first apartment hunt was a nightmare. We'd tour places together. I'd fall in love with a cozy one-bedroom in the North End, and then he'd schedule a second viewing so she could see it too. Without fail, she'd find something wrong with every place I liked. Too noisy, too expensive, not good for resale value, weird neighbors. We ended up in a sterile 2-bedroom in Cambridge that she practically picked out herself. I didn't even realize until we'd signed the lease that the second bedroom was set up as a home office, but somehow she had a key and would come over to use it whenever she needed a quiet place to work. The financial stuff started gradually. At first, it was just casual mentions of what she thought about our spending habits. She'd notice I'd bought new shoes and comment about how we should be saving for a house instead. She had opinions about our grocery budget, our date nights, even the brand of coffee we bought. Somehow these casual observations turned into actual input on our financial decisions. When we were looking at buying a car, she came with us to the dealership. She negotiated with the salesman while my husband and I just stood there. She knew more about our credit scores than I did. Then came the house hunting. I'd been dreaming of a little place in Somerville, maybe with a small yard where we could have barbecues and I could try gardening. But she convinced him we needed to think about our future family and school districts. We ended up with a 3-bedroom colonial in the suburbs that felt more like her vision of our life than ours. The master bedroom has this weird layout where you can see directly into the kitchen from the bed, and she mentioned during the walkthrough that it would be perfect for keeping an eye on things. I didn't understand what she meant then. The baby conversation was where things got really weird. We'd been married for 2 years, and I was ready to start trying. But every time I brought it up, he'd get this distant look and say we should talk to her about timing. Apparently, she had concerns about our financial readiness, our career stability, and whether we'd properly prepared for the responsibility. She wanted us to take a parenting class first, read specific books, and have a certain amount in savings. I felt like I needed her permission to get pregnant with my own husband. What really got to me was how she'd insert herself into our intimate life without actually being there. She'd ask him pointed questions about how we were doing as a couple, whether we were communicating well, if we were spending enough quality time together. Then he'd come home with suggestions for date nights she'd recommended, conversation topics she thought we should explore, even advice about how we should handle disagreements. It felt like she was managing our relationship from the outside. The breaking point came 3 months ago during a dinner party at our house. I'd spent all day cooking, cleaning, and getting everything perfect. Our friends were having a great time, laughing and sharing stories when she showed up fashionably late. Within minutes, she'd somehow taken over as hostess of my own party. She was refilling drinks, directing conversations, and even rearranging the appetizers I'd carefully plated. When someone complimented the food, she jumped in to suggest improvements for next time. My husband just watched it all happen with this proud smile, like he was watching his 2 favorite people work together. Later that night, after everyone had left, I finally exploded. I told him I felt like a third wheel in my own marriage, that every decision we made together somehow required her approval, and that I was tired of feeling like she knew my husband better than I did. He got defensive immediately, saying I was being jealous and unreasonable. He reminded me of all the ways she'd helped us, how she'd been there for him long before I came along, and how important her friendship was to him. The fight lasted until 4 a.m., with both of us saying things we couldn't take back. The next morning he apologized, but in that careful way that didn't actually acknowledge what I was upset about. He promised to set better boundaries, to include me more in decisions, and to make sure I felt heard in our relationship. For a few weeks, things seemed better. He paused before calling her about things, asked for my opinion first, and make an effort to plan activities just for us. But the boundaries didn't stick. Gradually she crept back into every aspect of our lives. She had opinions about the contractors we hired to fix our leaky roof. She weighed in on which of his job offers he should accept. She even had thoughts about what we should do for our third wedding anniversary. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, like maybe I really was just being paranoid and possessive. The discovery happened completely by accident. I'd forgotten my laptop charger at work and needed to check an important email, so I borrowed his computer. His messages were open, and I saw her name at the top of the conversation list. I wasn't trying to snoop, I swear, but the preview of their most recent exchange caught my eye. It was about our weekend plans, but the tone was wrong. Too intimate, too familiar, filled with inside jokes and references I didn't understand. I scrolled up, telling myself I'd just read a few messages to confirm I was overreacting. What I found instead was months of conversations that read like they were between romantic partners, not just friends. They talked about missing each other, about how hard it was to pretend in front of me, about plans for when they could finally be together properly. There were messages about her staying late at our house when I was out of town, about secret meetups at restaurants across town, about how guilty they felt but how they couldn't stop. The financial stuff suddenly made sense too. She wasn't just giving us advice about money, she was actively managing accounts I didn't even know existed. They had joint credit cards, shared investment accounts, and she was listed as a beneficiary on policies I'd never seen. Our house wasn't even in both our names, it was in his name and hers, with me somehow excluded from the ownership entirely despite contributing to the down payment. But the worst part wasn't the money or even the emotional affair. It was reading messages about me. How I was too needy, too controlling, too suspicious. How they had to be careful about their phone calls because I might overhear. How they were just waiting for the right time to make their relationship official after they figured out how to handle the divorce. They'd been planning my exit from my own marriage. I sat there for hours, reading through months of messages, trying to piece together how long this had been going on. The evidence went back almost to our wedding day. Comments about how beautiful the ceremony was, but how it felt wrong because they couldn't be together. Messages about how hard it was to watch us exchange vows when they wanted to be exchanging their own. Plans for trips they'd taken together, disguised as work conferences or visits to family. The cruelest part was realizing that every major decision in our marriage hadn't just been influenced by her, it had been designed to benefit their relationship. The house in the suburbs wasn't about good schools for our future kids, it was in her neighborhood, 5 minutes from her place. The home office wasn't for us, it was so she'd have a reason to come over whenever she wanted. Even our delayed plans for children weren't about financial readiness. They were about not wanting a baby to complicate their eventual transition to being together openly. I printed everything. Every message, every photo, every document I could find that proved what they'd been doing. Then I called in sick to work and spent the day figuring out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I felt like I'd been living someone else's life for 4 years, playing a role in a story where I was never meant to be the main character. Update 1 posted 3 weeks later. I can't believe how much my life has changed in just 3 weeks. The support from everyone here has been incredible, and I wanted to update you on what's happened since I discovered the truth about my husband and his so-called best friend. First, I had to get my head straight about the legal stuff. I took all those printed messages and documents to someone who could help me understand what I was dealing with financially. Turns out, the situation was even worse than I'd realized. Not only was I not on the deed to our house, but there were several credit cards and loans in our names that I'd never signed for. She'd been forging my signature on financial documents for over 2 years. The house we'd been living in wasn't just in their names, it was purchased using funds from accounts where my paychecks had been directly deposited but somehow transferred out before I could see the statements. The level of financial fraud was staggering. My husband had been having my mail redirected to a P.O. box that she controlled, so I never saw the real bank statements, credit card bills, or legal documents. What I thought were our joint accounts were actually just accounts with my name on them that she had full access to. They'd been systematically draining money from our marriage to fund their relationship, including paying for weekend getaways, expensive dinners, and even what looked like an engagement ring. Confronting him was somehow both easier and harder than I'd expected. I waited until a Saturday morning when I knew she wouldn't be around, printed out the most damning messages, and laid them out on our kitchen table. When he came downstairs for coffee, I was sitting there with all the evidence spread out like a crime scene investigation. His face went through about 5 different emotions in 10 seconds. Surprise, panic, guilt, anger, and then this weird kind of relief, like he was almost glad the secret was finally out. He didn't try to deny it or make excuses. He just sat down across from me and started talking. Apparently, they'd been in love since college but never acted on it because they were both in other relationships. When he and I got serious, he convinced himself that what he felt for her was just deep friendship. But being around her constantly while trying to build a life with me made everything more complicated. He said the emotional affair started about 6 months after our wedding, when they realized they couldn't just be friends anymore. What really got to me was how he described their decision-making process. They didn't set out to manipulate me or control our marriage maliciously. In his mind, he was trying to balance his commitment to me with his feelings for her, and somehow that evolved into letting her guide our life decisions because it felt like a compromise. If she was helping shape our life, then in some twisted way, he was honoring both relationships. He admitted that the financial stuff had gotten out of hand. It started with her helping him manage money because she was good with numbers, but it spiraled into something much more controlling. She convinced him that I didn't need to know about all the accounts because it would just stress me out, and that she could handle everything more efficiently. The forged signatures were her idea, something she justified as protecting me from having to deal with boring paperwork. The hardest part of the conversation was when he told me he'd been planning to ask for a divorce for months, but kept putting it off because he didn't know how to explain the situation without destroying multiple lives. He knew I'd be devastated, and he was terrified of how our families and friends would react to him leaving me for someone who'd been our friend throughout our entire relationship. I asked him if he'd ever actually loved me or if I'd just been some kind of placeholder until he figured out how to be with her. He swore that his feelings for me had been real but admitted that they'd been complicated from the beginning by his unresolved feelings for her. He said living with that internal conflict had made him lean on her more and more for guidance, until she was basically making all his decisions for him. By the end of that conversation, we both knew our marriage was over. Not because of anger or betrayal, although those feelings were definitely there, but because it was impossible to come back from something this fundamentally dishonest. How do you rebuild trust with someone who's been living a double life for years? How do you create intimacy with a person who's been emotionally intimate with someone else throughout your entire relationship? The divorce process has been surprisingly smooth, probably because he's so guilty that he's agreeing to everything my legal representative suggests. I'm getting the house, even though I wasn't on the original deed, because I can prove my financial contributions and the fraudulent way my name was kept off the paperwork. I'm also getting back all the money that was moved out of our accounts without my knowledge, plus damages for the financial fraud. But the weirdest part has been dealing with our social circle. Some friends have been incredibly supportive, rallying around me and expressing outrage at how I was deceived. Others seem to think this is just a messy situation where everyone made mistakes and they're trying to stay neutral. A few people have actually suggested that I should have seen this coming, or that I must have known on some level what was happening. The reactions have shown me who my real friends are. My sister has been amazing, letting me stay at her place when I needed space from the house and helping me sort through 4 years of belongings to figure out what's actually mine. My best friend from work has been screening my calls and dealing with people who want to gossip about the situation. Even some acquaintances have surprised me with their kindness and support. The hardest part hasn't been the betrayal or even the divorce logistics. It's been questioning everything I thought I knew about my own judgment and intuition. How did I live with someone for 4 years and not realize he was in love with someone else? How did I miss signs of financial fraud happening right under my nose? How did I let myself be gradually pushed out of decisions in my own life? I've been staying busy with work and spending time with people who actually care about me, but the self-doubt creeps in at weird moments. When I'm grocery shopping and have to make decisions about what to buy without checking with anyone. When I'm watching TV and realize I can choose what to watch without negotiating or getting approval. When I come home to a quiet house and remember that I don't have to worry about someone else's friend dropping by unannounced. The freedom is both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in years, my life is entirely my own, but I'd forgotten how to make decisions without considering someone else's reaction or approval. I'm learning to trust my own instincts again, to believe that my preferences and opinions are valid even when no one else is around to validate them. Update 2, posted 2 months later. It's been 2 months since my last update, and I honestly didn't expect to be writing another one so soon. But something happened last week that I felt like I needed to share, especially after all the support and advice you've given me throughout this whole mess. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks ago. It was one of those surreal moments where you sign a bunch of papers and suddenly a 4-year marriage just legally stops existing. My ex-husband and his girlfriend weren't there, which was probably better for everyone involved. I walked out of that courthouse feeling empty rather than relieved, like I'd just finished a really long, exhausting job that I never wanted in the first place. I've been living in the house by myself, which has been an adjustment. At first it felt too big and too quiet. I'd catch myself listening for sounds of other people expecting someone to come through the door or call out from another room. But gradually I started to appreciate having a space that was entirely mine. I rearranged the furniture, painted the guest bedroom a color I actually liked, and turned the home office into a reading nook with plants and comfortable chairs. Work has been a good distraction. I threw myself into projects and started taking on responsibilities I'd avoided before because they would have required travel or late hours that my ex-husband wouldn't have approved of. It felt good to make professional decisions based solely on what I wanted to do and what was best for my career without having to consider how it would affect someone else's plans or feelings. But the real reason I'm writing this update is because of what happened last Tuesday. I was at the grocery store just doing my weekly shopping when I ran into her. My ex-husband's girlfriend, the woman who'd controlled my marriage from the shadows for years. We literally bumped into each other in the produce section, both reaching for the same bag of apples. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I hadn't seen her since I'd discovered the truth about their relationship, and I honestly wasn't sure how I'd react if I ever encountered her in person. Part of me had imagined this dramatic confrontation where I'd tell her exactly what I thought of her manipulation and deception. Another part of me had hoped I'd never have to see her again. But when it actually happened, I felt surprisingly calm. Maybe it was because I was on my own turf, just going about my normal life, while she looked uncomfortable and caught off guard. Or maybe it was because enough time had passed that the raw anger had settled into something more manageable. She was the one who spoke first. She said my name tentatively, like she wasn't sure if I'd acknowledge her or just walk away. Then she asked if we could talk, said she'd been wanting to reach out to me but hadn't known how. I was curious enough about what she might have to say that I agreed to get coffee at the little cafe in the shopping plaza. What she told me over the next hour completely changed how I understood everything that had happened in my marriage. I'd assumed that she was the mastermind behind the deception, the one who'd systematically manipulated both my ex-husband and me to get what she wanted. But according to her version of events, the situation had been much more complicated than I'd realized. She said that she'd been in love with my ex-husband since college, but that he'd made it clear their relationship was purely platonic. When he started dating me, she tried to be supportive and step back from their friendship to give us space. But he kept coming to her for advice, emotional support, and help with decisions, even after we got married. She felt like he was using their friendship as a substitute for dealing with problems in our marriage. The financial control that had seemed so calculating and manipulative? According to her, my ex-husband had begged her to help him manage money because he was overwhelmed by adult responsibilities and didn't want to burden me with his anxiety about finances. She said she'd suggested multiple times that he should involve me in financial decisions, but he always had excuses for why that wouldn't work. Even the forged signatures on documents weren't her idea. Apparently, my ex-husband had been intercepting mail and handling paperwork without telling either of us, then asking her to help him figure out what to do when things got complicated. She claimed she'd told him repeatedly that he needed to be honest with me about our financial situation, but he was too afraid of my reaction to come clean. The romantic relationship between them had developed gradually, she said, as they spent more time together trying to manage the various crises my ex-husband created by avoiding direct communication with me. They both felt guilty about their growing feelings, but neither of them knew how to address the situation without hurting me or destroying their friendship. I'm not sure how much of her story I actually believe. It's possible she was trying to minimize her own responsibility for what happened, or painting herself as more innocent than she actually was. But some of what she said rang true, especially the parts about my ex-husband's conflict avoidance and his tendency to let other people make difficult decisions for him. What struck me most was how exhausted she seemed when she talked about their relationship. This wasn't a woman who was gloating about winning some kind of competition for my husband's affections. She seemed genuinely troubled by how everything had unfolded and worried about whether she and my ex-husband could actually build a healthy relationship given how it had started. She told me that they'd been having problems since they'd started living together openly. Without the excitement and secrecy of their affair, they were discovering that their dynamic was just as unhealthy as what he'd had with me. He was still avoiding difficult conversations, still looking to her to make major decisions, still unable to handle conflict or uncertainty without someone else's guidance. The most surprising part of our conversation was when she apologized. Not just for the affair or the deception, but for not recognizing sooner how her involvement in our marriage was damaging everyone involved. She said she convinced herself that she was helping, that her input was making our relationship stronger. But now she could see how her presence had prevented my ex-husband and me from developing our own communication patterns and decision-making processes. She also admitted that she'd been jealous of me, not just because I was married to the man she loved, but because I seemed to have the kind of independence and self-assurance that she'd never developed. She'd grown up in a family where women were expected to manage men's emotional needs, and she'd never learned how to have a relationship that wasn't built around caretaking and control. By the end of our conversation, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not for the situation she was in with my ex-husband, but for the fact that she seemed as trapped by unhealthy relationship patterns as I had been. The difference was that I was now free to work on changing those patterns, while she was still stuck in the same dynamic that had caused so much damage. We didn't hug goodbye or promise to stay in touch. But there was a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. For months I'd been carrying around this image of her as some kind of evil mastermind who deliberately destroyed my marriage. Learning that the reality was more complicated and messier didn't excuse what had happened, but it helped me understand that the problems in my marriage went deeper than just her interference. The conversation also made me realize how much I'd grown over the past few months. 6 months ago, I would have been devastated to hear that my ex-husband was still struggling with the same issues that had plagued our marriage. I would have felt responsible for fixing him, or guilty for not being patient enough to help him work through his problems. But sitting in that cafe, listening to her describe their current relationship troubles, I felt nothing but relief that those weren't my problems anymore. I wasn't responsible for managing his emotional needs, helping him make decisions, or teaching him how to communicate honestly. Those were things he needed to figure out for himself, preferably with professional help rather than by depending on another woman to guide him through life. Final update, posted 4 months later. I promised myself I wouldn't keep updating this story indefinitely, but something happened recently that feels like the perfect ending to this whole chapter of my life, so I wanted to share it with all of you who've been following along. It's been 4 months since my divorce was finalized, and I can honestly say I'm happier now than I've been in years. Not just because I'm out of a bad situation, but because I've rediscovered who I am when I'm not constantly trying to accommodate someone else's needs and expectations. The house has become truly mine. I've hosted dinner parties where I cook what I want to eat, decorated rooms in colors that make me happy, and created spaces that reflect my actual interests rather than some compromised version of my personality. I planted a garden in the backyard and spent Saturday mornings this summer learning how to grow tomatoes and herbs. It sounds silly, but there's something deeply satisfying about making decisions based purely on what brings me joy. Work has been going incredibly well. Without the constant stress and distraction of my marriage problems, I've been able to focus on projects that actually interest me. I took on a challenging assignment that required traveling to 3 different cities over 2 months, something I never could have done when I had to coordinate every decision with my ex-husband and his girlfriend. The project was successful enough that I've been offered a promotion with significantly more responsibility and better pay. But the real transformation has been in how I approach relationships. I've been dating cautiously at first, then with more confidence as I've learned to trust my own judgment again. I'm not in a serious relationship yet, and I'm honestly not sure I'm ready for that level of commitment. But I've enjoyed getting to know people without the pressure of trying to fit them into some predetermined idea of what my life should look like. The most surprising thing has been how different I am in romantic situations now. I speak up when I disagree with something, I make suggestions about what we should do together, and I don't automatically defer to the other person's preferences. I'd forgotten how good it feels to be with someone who actually wants to know what I think, who values my opinions and treats my feelings as important. I've also reconnected with friendships that had gotten neglected during my marriage. Without realizing it, I'd gradually pulled back from people who might have questioned the dynamics in my relationship or who didn't mesh well with my ex-husband and his girlfriend. Now I have regular coffee dates, game nights, and weekend trips with people who knew me before I got married and who remind me of parts of my personality I'd lost along the way. The reason I'm writing this final update is because of something that happened 2 weeks ago. I was at a bookstore downtown, browsing in the biography section, when someone behind me said my name. I turned around and it was my ex-husband. He looked different than I remembered. Older, maybe, or just tired. He was by himself, which surprised me because I'd gotten used to thinking of him as someone who was always accompanied by his girlfriend. We made awkward small talk for a few minutes about work and the weather, and then he asked if I had time to get coffee. I almost said no. I'd worked hard to move on from that relationship, and I wasn't sure what good could come from rehashing old problems. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to spend an hour talking with him at a cafe across the street. What he told me was both surprising and completely predictable. His relationship with his girlfriend had fallen apart about a month earlier. According to him, they'd never been able to figure out how to be together in a healthy way. All the patterns that had caused problems in our marriage had continued in their relationship, but without the buffer of secrecy and external obstacles, they'd become even more toxic. He'd become completely dependent on her for every decision, from what to wear to work to how to spend his free time. She'd grown resentful of the constant responsibility for managing his life, but hadn't known how to step back without feeling like she was abandoning him. They'd had the same fights over and over again, with him accusing her of being controlling and her accusing him of being helpless. The breaking point had come when she'd suggested he get professional help to work on his anxiety and decision-making issues. Instead of seeing this as a supportive suggestion, he'd gotten defensive and accused her of thinking he was broken. They'd had a huge fight that ended with her moving out and telling him she couldn't be in a relationship with someone who refused to take responsibility for his own emotional needs. He'd spent the past month living alone for the first time in his adult life, and the experience had been eye-opening. Without anyone to rely on for constant guidance and support, he'd been forced to make his own decisions about everything from what to eat for dinner to how to spend his weekends. It had been terrifying at first, but gradually he'd started to realize how much of his adult life he'd spent avoiding independence. He apologized to me, not just for the affair and the financial deception, but for the way he'd treated me throughout our marriage. He said he could see now how his inability to communicate directly and make decisions independently had put an unfair burden on our relationship. He realized that by constantly seeking his girlfriend's input on our marriage, he'd essentially been asking her to solve problems that he and I should have worked through together. The most meaningful part of his apology was when he acknowledged that I'd tried multiple times to address the issues in our marriage, but he dismissed my concerns because facing them would have required him to change in ways that felt scary and difficult. He said he could see now that I'd been asking for basic respect and partnership, not making unreasonable demands. He also told me that he'd started going to individual counseling, something he'd resisted for years because he'd seen it as an admission of failure. He was working on understanding why he'd always looked for other people to manage his emotional life, and learning tools for making decisions and handling conflict on his own. I was glad he was getting help, but I also felt a strange detachment from his problems. 6 months earlier, hearing that he was struggling would have made me want to help him or give him advice. But sitting in that cafe, I realized that his personal growth journey had nothing to do with me anymore. I wished him well, but I didn't feel responsible for his happiness or success. When he asked if I thought we could ever be friends, I was honest with him. The betrayal and deception had damaged my ability to trust him, and I couldn't imagine a scenario where we'd have a close relationship again. But more than that, I'd built a life that didn't include him, and I wasn't interested in going backward. He seemed sad but not surprised by my answer. He said he'd hoped we might be able to salvage some kind of friendship, but he understood why that wasn't possible. He thanked me for being willing to talk with him and said that seeing how well I was doing made him feel less guilty about how everything had ended. We parted ways cordially, but I knew it was probably the last time we'd speak. Walking back to my car, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. For months I'd carried around anger and hurt about how my marriage had ended. Seeing my ex-husband taking responsibility for his actions and working on his issues didn't erase what had happened, but it did give me confidence that I'd made the right decision in leaving. The experience also made me appreciate how much I'd changed. The woman who'd been married to him would have felt obligated to offer support, advice, or encouragement. She would have felt guilty about his loneliness and wondered if she could have done more to save their relationship. But the woman I am now felt nothing but relief that his problems were no longer mine to solve. I'm not sure what comes next in my life. I'm open to the possibility of another serious relationship eventually, but I'm also perfectly content with the independence I've built. I have work that challenges me, friendships that nourish me, and a home that reflects who I actually am rather than who I thought I should be. The most important thing I've learned from this whole experience is that a healthy relationship should make you more yourself, not less. My marriage had gradually eroded my confidence, my decision-making ability, and my sense of my own preferences and opinions. I'd become so focused on managing someone else's emotions and accommodating their needs that I'd lost track of what I actually wanted from my own life. Now I know the difference between compromise and self-erasure, between being supportive and being controlled. I know what it feels like to make decisions based on my own values and preferences, and I'm not willing to give that up for anyone who can't appreciate and respect my independence. I wanted to end this story by thanking everyone who commented on my original post and updates. Your support, advice, and shared experiences helped me feel less alone during the hardest parts of this process. Reading about other people who'd survived similar situations gave me hope that I could rebuild my life, and hearing from people who'd recognized the red flags I'd missed helped me trust my own instincts again. If anyone reading this is in a similar situation, wondering if they're overreacting to feeling controlled or sidelined in their own relationship, I want you to know that your instincts are probably right. Healthy relationships don't require you to constantly question your own judgment or seek permission for basic life decisions. You deserve to be with someone who values your input, respects your autonomy, and wants to build a life with you rather than for you. It's been almost a year since I first discovered the truth about my marriage, and I can honestly say that leaving was the best decision I ever made. Not because I'm bitter or angry about what happened, but because I finally have the chance to live a life that's authentically mine. And that, more than any relationship, is worth everything I went through to get here.